Just give us a couple of more seconds. We're seeing the room is getting quite full. Should be able to start in just a couple of seconds. All right. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel on the legacy of the Korean War. My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. Speaking of endless war, today, June 25th, is the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War, which technically remains ongoing till this day because it ended with a truce, not a formal peace treaty. This is the forgotten war in the United States, but it really sealed America's post-World War II fate in many ways, including recalibrating the executive congressional balance of powers on war making. President Truman went to war without a declaration from Congress, setting the stage for future presidents to circumvent Congress when sending troops overseas. Truman defended America's war in Korea and spoke of it as police action authorized by the UN Security Council, even though the Constitution of the United States is quite clear that wars have to be declared by Congress, not by the president, nor by the United Nations. The Korean War also cemented the post-World War II military-industrial complex, which has grown into a seemingly unbreakable iron triangle of federal budget appropriations, weapons procurement, and lobbying contributions to members of Congress by the arms corporations. This panel will discuss how the United States became so heavily militarized and what we might do to walk back the endless war preparation, endless war footing, and endless war making. We are honored to have with us today Congressman Ro Khanna, representing California's 17th District in Silicon Valley. He is a member of the House Armed Services Committee and chief sponsor of HRES 152, calling for a formal end to the Korean War. We also have Mary Dudziak, a QI non-resident fellow and professor of law at Emory University School of Law, as well as Nikhil Pal Singh, who is a QI non-resident fellow and professor of social and cultural analysis and history at NYU. QI's own CEO, Laura Lumpy, will be moderating the conversation. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, as always, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and Laura will get to those throughout the conversation. If you are watching this on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, please put your questions in the comment section and we will try to get to those as well. So without any further ado, please welcome Laura, who will kick off the conversation. Laura?
Thank you, Sridhar, and good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to our panelists. I'm so pleased to be with you and really excited for this conversation. I want to first give a shout out to Rep. Khanna, who, as Sridhar said, has a very distinguished career, not only in Congress, but having served in the Commerce Department. He is a champion of every progressive foreign policy issue out there, and we're delighted to have him. I'm equally delighted to have two of my non-resident fellow Quincy colleagues on this panel. One of the very first things I read about war powers was an op-ed piece that Mary Dudziak wrote. And one of the very first Quincy Institute pieces I read was a brilliant brief that Nikhil wrote called Enough Toxic Militarism, which is so unfortunately prescient, always timely. I want to start with Nikhil. Nikhil, you wrote a wonderful piece in the Boston Review called Banking on the Cold War, in which you said that James Forrestal, then the Secretary of the Navy under Truman, was the godfather of the corporate military order. You talked about a decisive bureaucratic battle that he fought and won, advocating for what he called a state of ongoing semi-war that we are in to this day. The national security budget now consumes well over half the federal discretionary budget and up to 70% if you count long-term health care and liabilities being carried forward and debt servicing. So I wonder if you could start by setting the stage for us and tell us about this history and what you learned from the bureaucratic infighting of the late 40s and 50s from the first Cold War, again, particularly as we're on the cusp, as Trita said, of a second Cold War with China. What's similar today to then, and what's dissimilar in terms of the politics and the political economy that might help us course correct and head off this second Cold War?
Well, there are a lot of questions in that opening comments. I'll try to take them in turn. I want to start by thanking the Quincy Institute for hosting this event. And I also want to just note for the purposes of our discussion, and it might come up later, that we're commemorating the anniversary of the Korean War, and we're discussing its impact on the United States defense establishment and its creation. And I would really encourage the Quincy Institute to think about having another panel where we think about the impact of the Korean War on the Korean Peninsula. I think one of the challenges for Americans, even those of us who are very critical of American foreign policy, is that we wind up in situations where we don't actually inform our country about the impact of our policies on the rest of the world and how destructive they have been. So I just wanted to note that, that especially for our Korean audience, if we have one today. James Forrestal is a fascinating character because he's the first U.S. Secretary of Defense. He's the Secretary of the Navy before that, as Laura pointed out. And he has two overriding concerns in 1945. One is that the United States maintains its Pacific Island bases that it's seized from Japan and also taken from Great Britain during World War II. So the infrastructure of what will become the post-war American empire of bases is really on his mind as early as 1945. And he's going to be the one who really, really insists that these, as he calls, treasures won through American blood remain in American hands. And it's a kind of it's a controversial thing because really it involves the reassertion of kind of territorial colonization of these places, some of which have remained colonies really since that time, if we think of the Pacific Islands in particular. The second thing that Forrestal is really concerned about is that the American public now lacks the viscera of martial ambition that he thinks is necessary to sustain what he sees as a future war that he believes is coming with the Soviet Union and with American adversaries in the world that might emerge, but that we don't know yet. And so Forrestal is arguing that we cannot relax after World War II. We have to maintain a military budget and a state of preparedness and what he calls anticipatory policy that is not calibrated to a realistic or rational sense of our defense needs, but that's actually calibrated to what might happen under worst case scenarios. And that kind of expansive, elastic, almost paranoid sense of what needs to come leads him to this kind of obsessive concern about the budget. So I spent a lot of time in Forrestal's diaries many years ago. And the one thing that you can say about the origins of American empire is that in the post-war period is that it's a painstakingly boring project. He's extremely concerned about the numbers. And that the budget's going to fall and fall and fall because Truman is a hard money man and he's not going to allow for defense spending to grow. And Forrestal doesn't live to see the breakthrough. When he dies in 1949 in a mental hospital, having committed suicide by most accounts, he hasn't won this battle yet. This battle he's been fighting to kind of up the defense budget through all of these connections he's making with people in Congress and people in the business world. And he really is the one who's outlining that iron triangle that Trita talked about in his opening remarks. But the Korean War allows for the breakthrough. And Dean Acheson, Forrestal's colleague, makes the famous comment that Korea saved us. And when Acheson says Korea saved us, what he means is it allowed the policy breakthrough that broke the budget impasses around growing American military spending. And the country never looks back from that point forward.
Thank you. It's really resonant with where we're at right now in terms of preparing for a threat that might be as opposed to what is. You know, we're hearing this very much in reference to China right now. I also just wanted to note, you're absolutely right. I had a long prepared introduction and Trita did such a good job that I chucked all of that aside. But one of the things I wanted to say at the outset was, of course, it is right to be commemorating the impacts of the war on the millions and to be remembering the 5 million Koreans who were killed in this war. Quincy's holding a panel on July 27th with women across the DMZ and the American Conservative to assess the legacy 70 years later in terms of inter-Korean relations, ongoing concerns about North Korea's nuclear potential and ambitions, and the US-South Korean relationship. I want to pivot for a second from that history, that picture you painted of how we got here to a place where 70 years later we are locked in the Iron Triangle, and turn to Representative Khanna. You've worked as a lawyer, in addition to your illustrious career on the Hill. You've worked as a lawyer specializing in intellectual property. You were a deputy assistant secretary of commerce in the Obama administration. You served on Governor Brown's California Workforce Investment Board, and you've written a book on why manufacturing is still key to America's future. So through all of this and your current representation of your congressional district, you're clearly deeply committed to job creation, both in your own district, Silicon Valley, and across the nation and indeed the world. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how the U.S. invests in other sectors of the manufacturing economy. What does it do anything approximating what it does in the weapons industry and other sectors? And is this industrial strategy effective as a national jobs program?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the Quincy Institute panel with such distinguished panelists. I think the challenge for our country is post-globalization and post some of the automation. What you've seen is manufacturing output in America quadruple, but employment has stagnated. And there are a number of reasons for that. There's some of it that went offshore, some of it that automated or moved towards more advanced manufacturing. But we didn't replace it with much. I mean, imagine in America if manufacturing had been just concentrated in 4 or 5 cities. We wouldn't have had a significant middle class or industrial base. And yet what we've replaced it, the new industry, the technology industry, has been so concentrated in a handful of urban centers. And so the multiplier effect of that innovation economy has been also concentrated in large parts of the country, and predominantly African-American areas in rural South. The rural communities have been totally left behind of this economic prosperity. And I think in part this economic divide is explained by that. So what we need is an intentionality of job creation on place-based policy, where we look at regions that have not been successful in a post-globalization, post-manufacturing world, and how do we create either advanced manufacturing capacity or some technology-related jobs that will have multiplier effects for the larger economy. And I think that for the last 30 years, the federal government has largely had a hands-off policy, which has said that the market can determine where people go, and we can always redistribute the gains of the economy. That has done 2 things. One, those gains haven't always been redistributed, and so you haven't had the redistribution to healthcare and education. But secondly, that people don't want simply a handout. They want dignified work. And it's not enough to say that we're going to have concentrated economic activity in certain regions and other regions are just going to be decimated, where your choice is to either move or live in economically struggling areas. And so what I would say is advocate for is a comprehensive strategy that focuses not just on college jobs, but also apprenticeship jobs or jobs that require some certification, credentialing in these regions, that's focused in part on manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, but also on all the types of new industry and technology that we have.
So that's very helpful. How though, could I ask you, do you see the $800 billion a year investment in the military budget? Is the investment that we are putting into arms industrial production, are we investing in any other sector at that pace, in that scope? And if not, how do we shift from how do we make way to shift from that arms industrial economy to the more 21st century economy that you were just describing, distributed along the lines you talked about geographically, ideally, but first of all, simply shifting from the production of unnecessary warfighting equipment that we're seeing in our police forces now. How do we get away from a place where we're producing equipment that we don't even need to a place where we're investing in those green jobs that we do need?
Well, there's no question in my mind that the defense budget is bloated. We have an amendment to lower it by 10%. That's going to be a hard lift. Obama left it around 600 billion. I think Bill Clinton left it around 430 billion, and it's now nearly at 740 billion. So and a large part of that, as you know, the Overseas Contingency Fund isn't even for domestic investment. It's largely for overseas wars. I can't think off the top of my head of anything that comes close. I mean, even when you look at a call for $2 trillion of infrastructure, that's $2 trillion over 10 years. So it would be 200 billion a year. And the defense spending is far more. Now, some of that is on personnel, and the personnel cost is a large part of its salary. So it's not all on production. Some of it is on the fact that we pay our troops better than people in other countries, but there is certainly a large part of it that is on equipment, and then we have to look at what are areas that would be better, more strategic investments for the country than this. I think one of the things that the defense industry has been smart about is to be distributed. So they have created stakeholders in every congressional district in every part of the country. And of course, there was a famous debate between Vannevar Bush and Senator Kilmore in 1945, where Bush comes out, who leads the science and technology efforts in World War II, and his famous report, Endless Frontier, convinces Americans to invest 2% in science and basic science research, which is a good thing. But all that research, Bush says, basically should go to MIT and Stanford and the elite institutions. Kilmore was the senator for West Virginia, was saying, no, we need the science and technology investment to be more distributed geographically. And he loses that debate. And we agree with Bush that we need the scientific investment, but we don't distribute it geographically. I think that has a huge consequence, because I think if you have investment that is concentrated geographically, it's very hard to build broad coalitions of political support for it in the Congress. And so if we want to have alternative jobs creation programs to defense spending, it's very important that the benefits of that be seen as geographically distributed.
How do we, on the outside, if you often read that $1 invested at the DoD gets you about half the number of jobs that dollar being invested in any other sector of the economy would get you. So of course that the distribution across all congressional districts is part of what keeps Congress voting for equipment that the Pentagon doesn't even want at times. How do you think we on the outside, writers, citizens, think tankers, can most effectively help you and Congress and others who, you said it's going to be a heavy lift to cut the budget even now, even after the pandemic, even after the racial justice movement in our streets. How can we best help you advance that shift from those unnecessary and less productive and not job efficient investments into technologies of the future that actually create more jobs per dollar?
Well, I think we have to make two cases. We have to make the case on American national interest, that why the types of investments in the technologies of the future may actually give us a better strategic advantage to China and other countries, that the competition is going to be who creates the technologies of the future, who leads in those industries, why we wouldn't want to invest in the creation of 5G here, as opposed to some of the defense spending is an issue of national security. And the fact is that I was with Speaker Pelosi at the Munich conference, and everyone was lecturing Europeans not to use Huawei. And then the former president of Estonia said, well, what do you recommend? What's the alternative? And America has to be in a position to provide those technological alternatives to be able to lead. So we have to make the case for an expanded definition of national security. And then we have to make the case for what alternative good investments in jobs look like. I mean, often I think the progressive messaging is flawed sometimes because we just talk about cuts in defense without the next sentence. Well, what do you want to do with that money that's going to create jobs? It has to be a pro-jobs message and a concrete message of where that funding would go that would create those jobs.
I want to bring Mary Dudziak in. Another really important legacy beyond the military-industrial complex of the Korean War was on democracy and the executive legislative balance of power in this country, and particularly Congress's abdication of its war-making responsibilities. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why the Truman administration decides to move forward with the Korean War without congressional war declaration. What was Congress's reaction at the time to its erosion of power? Why did they let that go?
Yeah, let me start by saying it's an honor to be here with you, and I want to especially acknowledge Congressman Rana and Kana, and thank you for HR 152, which I hope will be an occasion not just for bringing an formal end to the Korean War, but for having a conversation about the precedential effect of Korea, and maybe putting it in what is law professor is thinking about is the anti-canon, the canon of things we don't want to aspire to, sort of like Korematsu and the internment of Japanese Americans, thinking of Korea as a way not to go to war, as opposed to a precedent that gets relied on over and over. One of the interesting things as I went through the archives trying to figure out, I mean, really I went through sort of day by day in the Truman administration records, trying to figure out exactly how did Harry Truman make this consequential decision to go to war, this first big war without a congressional declaration and without any kind of congressional authorization at all. And the bottom line is, shockingly, they actually didn't even think it through. In the very early days, they rushed and essentially decided things without deciding them. Decided immediately that South Korea was a UN, creation of the UN, and so the UN was at stake if South Korea fell. And so we had to defend the UN, and so let's go to the UN Security Council. But going to the Security Council doesn't satisfy the US constitutional requirement that we go to war with a war declaration. So in the records, one of Truman's aides writes down, well, if we were gonna go to Congress, probably the day we should have done it was June 27th, just a few days after the war began. But apparently nobody thought about it at the time. So they really rushed ahead without thinking about their constitutional responsibilities. And then he goes on to say, once we did think about it seriously in early July, there was no way we'd get anywhere near a unanimous resolution. Well, excuse me, there wasn't a unanimous vote for World War I, and there wasn't even a unanimous vote for World War II. There's no need for the president to have unanimity in order to go to war. You only need a majority vote from Congress. And so that sort of moment where the Truman administration is thinking, gee, what we're looking for is an affirmation, an overall affirmation from Congress if we get anything. Well, that's the sort of toxic politics of war. And rather than looking to Congress as a source of constitutional authority, where Congress and the president produce war power together, the president looked to Congress as a political challenge. And if they couldn't get an affirmation from Congress that would really be a sort of celebrating what Truman was doing, then they didn't want to involve Congress at all. So, so they didn't think about it. And then when they thought about it, they treated Congress as sort of political opposition and not a necessary constitutional authority. I think one of the things that means is that we shouldn't look to this big war without an authorization or a declaration as a building block of presidential power. We need to disestablish Korea as a respectable precedent for the use of force. Korea that gets cited over and over again by later presidents as authority to go to war without Congress. So, we shouldn't be relying on a decision that was made so thoughtlessly.
Thank you. I want to bring in a question from the audience. I've got a bunch of follow-ups for you, but we've got a lot of questions piling up as well. And the first one from Barbara Reif asks why the Supreme Court hasn't addressed the issue of presidents arbitrarily declaring war instead of going to Congress. And I wonder if maybe you and or Representative Khanna want to have a response to that.
Well, let me just briefly and then turn it over. But the courts are reluctant to weigh in on war powers issues regarding the deployment of forces, especially when forces are in the field. Under the political question doctrine, the court generally says we can't touch this, and there's all sorts of reasons why the court might be ineffective, even if what would be the order that would sort of pull the troops back. But from my perspective, the only solution here is that this expansion of presidential power is co-produced by three elements. By presidents, but it's not just a presidential power grab. It's presidents acting, Congress not acting, and the American people being completely out of the game. So the American people don't care. I could say something more about that later. It relates to Nikhil's point that Americans aren't impacted by our wars. People in other countries are. It's been, over 100 years since we've only been going to war in other countries. All the massive civilian casualties are casualties of other countries. This is one of the things, it's a benefit for us, but it helps produce the profound apathy that we have. Americans aren't paying attention. But Congress certainly needs to pay more attention. And so I think Congress helps to produce the expansion of presidential power.
Maybe Representative Khanna, if you wouldn't mind jumping in, I'd be curious, you've been such a leader in both ensuring that we don't engage in unauthorized war actions against North Korea, against Venezuela, against Iran. And you have, as Trita and Mary pointed out, HRES 152, which would seek to end this long-running war. Mary just asserted, and I want to get back to Nikhil and get him in the conversation to talk about this, that the public doesn't generally care. So you're such a leader in these issues. Why? And what kind of reaction do you get from your constituents about these issues? And if you have anything also that you want to add to questions about how Congress plans to engage on taking back its war powers, that would be great to hear as well.
Well, I appreciate Professor Dudziak's perspective, and I agree with that. The reality is that the reason that the president has had such power on foreign affairs is not just the courts, it's that Congress in many cases has not wanted to vote. Congress has been perfectly content punting the decision and avoiding the hard votes and letting Congress, letting the president make those decisions. The court doesn't really even have to intervene. I mean, the reason the framers thought Congress would be so powerful is that the Congress has the power of the purse, and we don't need formal declarations or to deny authorization. Congress can defund activity at any point. We could have defunded the Iraq war. We could defund any activity in appropriations. Congress is just very reluctant to use the power of the purse. So a lot of the blame is in Congress's inaction, as opposed to saying, well, why don't you rescue us, Supreme Court? And the court will say, well, why haven't you defunded it? Why aren't you using the power that you have? Why aren't you at least pressing an authorization resolution against the president? So just coming the courts also are likely to defer to the branch that's been more assertive. In a lot of these cases, Congress is silent and the president is more assertive. I think that politically, obviously, it's easier to make the case that resources are going waste, that trillions of dollars are going waste, that is money that could have been spent in more productive ways here. I'm happy to hear Professor Singh's perspective. The moral case is a tougher case. I mean, obviously, in the Korean War, as Bruce Cummings's work shows, I mean, 25% of the civilian population in Korea was killed. We don't remember that; they do. And so, how do you have that empathy? And I guess Adam Smith has this famous passage, which everyone knows the first part, which says, if a person has a toe ache, they'll care more about that than some famine far away. But the interesting thing with Smith is he doesn't end there. He says, well, yeah, that may be our empathetic response, but we're also rational creatures. And as rational human beings, we should live by certain ethical laws that make us care about the person in starving or in famine far away. How we create that kind of moral framework to foreign policy is, of course, beyond my knowledge. But that is, I think, our challenge.
Indeed. Nikhil, I wonder if I could pull you in on that point. You've written very much about the connections between militarism and racism. The parallels couldn't be clearer right now in terms of literally having military on the streets, military equipment on the streets. I wonder what you would say to Rep. Khanna's question there about how do we engage the public to actually feel that empathy, to understand the impacts of U.S. Foreign policy, and what does this moment? How do we make the most of this moment to really help drive those connections home and try and drive that empathy into effective political action around U.S. foreign policy making?
Great question. I think what's so powerful and important about this conversation and thinking about the precedents of the Korean War is we can see these three really important precedents, and they've been already eliminated here by the comments by Mary and Representative Khanna, that it marks the beginning of a kind of loss of our democratic deliberative process over some of the most important questions that face us, questions of war and peace. It marks the substitution of militarism for sane macroeconomic industrial policy. And it also marks the beginning of 30 years of war in the Asian Rim lands, including interventions in Indonesia, including the Vietnam War, of course, which Eisenhower, only 1 year after the Korean War, is already thinking about in terms of the domino theory, which is where he first uses the term in 1954. We have to see this kind of continuity. And of course, when George H.W. Bush goes into Iraq in the 1990s, he talks about kicking the Vietnam syndrome. And when the Bush administration, the W. Bush administration, goes into Iraq again in the aughts, they are thinking about the problem of how do you restart this engine of war in the aftermath of the Clinton years, which are viewed as kind of feckless and not martial enough. So the urge to sort of restore military preparedness, military spending, and this kind of martial ambition at the center of our politics is something that we've become very kind of addicted to. And of course, it's had tremendous consequences economically, politically, and morally. And one of the consequences that you've pointed to, and I'm glad that Representative Khanna is using the language of defunding, because the language of defunding the police is on everyone's lips. It's the way in which our addiction to militarism has actually boomeranged, especially in the years since 9/11. Right before 9/11, we were having serious conversations in New York City about racial profiling and about police abuse. After 9/11, all the police on the streets of New York City had machine guns. And the city started stop and frisk, which was one of the most racially abusive policies the police have ever pursued, stopping millions and millions of people on pretextual basis, and mostly people of color. So the routinization of police abuse and the creation of the police, a mentality among the police where they actually see themselves in many ways as overseers of a suspect public, is something that I would argue has crept in many ways from our orientation to military intervention in the world. And I've obviously made this argument at much greater length in some of the things I've written. One of the places we can go back to for a moral framework is a speech like Dr. King's speech Beyond Vietnam, which he gave in 1967, which is one of the most remarkable documents in our political culture in the era since World War II. He makes the connections very, very clearly between warfare overseas and the neglect and erosion of public needs and public trust at home, and also public responsibility. And he makes the connection between a kind of racial animus that is sort of routed through threat inflation of various kinds of enemies, and the kind of racial animus that continues to recirculate through our own body politic. And I think that we have an opportunity now to connect some of the dots between these conversations. We do not have the opportunity to embark on a new Cold War that is not going to be tremendously destructive to our polity if we proceed along those lines. We do have an opportunity to, I think, engage in a major reassessment right now. And it's disheartening to me, frankly, Representative Khanna, that the idea of a 10% cut to the military budget is seen as a heavy lift. Because of course we need something much, much more dramatic than that.
Representative Khanna, do you want to respond to that in terms of the inability of Congress as a body, as a collective body, to meet this moment? We have had revealed pretty starkly that $750 billion a year national security budget is feckless, is completely useless in the face of what the country is going through right now, both in terms of the pandemic, but also contributing, as Nikhil just said, to the racial animus that we're also in the grips of. And so I wonder if the largest economic, and of course the pandemic has led to the largest economic collapse since the Great Depression. So if these three great crises don't result in an ability to cut quite modest 10% off the budget, what will it take, and how do we make this shift where we bust open the hold of militarism and military spending and these jobs on our economy and on our body politic? How if this isn't enough to do it, what would it take?
I'd introduced an amendment last year that to just freeze the defense budget at 2019 levels, which would have been saying that that included Trump's first defense increase from 620 billion to 700 some billion, but not to go along with the additional defense increase. And we lost that vote in committee. And I didn't even get the majority of Democrats to support the freezing of Trump's budget. And so the politics of it are still very difficult. And so the question is, how do you change the politics? I think one thing that the Quincy Institute may consider, which would be helpful, is to see a clear analysis of what the defense budget is at the 730 billion in a one-pager, and where the excessive parts are that aren't supporting national security, and what specific cuts would be there, as opposed to speaking in generalities, so that people can grasp the specifics. I mean, obviously the Overseas Contingency Fund is one, which I think is easy for people to grasp. We don't want some slush fund for foreign wars, but what other areas there are. And then I think it has to be made where this money would go instead, that would generate more jobs, and what the alternative vision is. But we have to win that a democratic debate. Right now, if you look at polling, Congress has no trust. obviously. The presidency has very little trust. Media has little trust. The highest polling institution in this country is the military. So people have still trust of the military and how to be seen as supporting our troops and our military without, while still recommending a more strategic budget for our national security, I think is the balance that people have to strike.
Mary, I wonder if we could bring you back in on that. You wrote a wonderful book called Wartime, on wartime and the law, in which you note that we now live in an era of endless war, which is stating the obvious, where it's no longer easy to distinguish between times of war and peace. And I wonder if you could talk about what this fugue state does to our democracy and to our society, and what you would recommend in terms of a way forward.
Well, one of the points I make in Wartime is that, we sort of tend to think that we enter war and war happens within a wartime, which is bound and ends, and then we end up with peacetime, right? So that policies that happen during wartime are by definition temporary, which then eclipse when we get to peacetime. But if you look at American history and sort of map across the timeline, all the conflicts that soldiers have gotten medals for, so for serving in combat, there's hardly any peacetime over the last 100 years or more, so that it shows us that the United States has persistently been at war. On the issue of the way forward, I'd like to suggest that the desire, there really is something there in terms of that you all have been talking about, the need to sort of reawaken some sort of politics of war in the country as a whole, because Congress has to get more involved, but Congress is nowhere unless when the American people are not the least bit interested. And I think that the effort to invoke empathy, although of course there should be empathy, right? When we get involved in conflicts like Korea and others in the Middle East now, where there is so much destruction of civilian life, that Americans should care about that, but actually people tend to be motivated by what affects them. And really, when you start looking at the defense budget, for example, the way that Representative Connaught was discussing it, it would be so helpful to make clear to Americans exactly what they're spending on defense. And wouldn't it be nice, just a small idea, if it was on their tax forms, so that when they fill out their tax forms, there's a category that would help them know exactly how many dollars they were spending. So I think finding ways of making it clear to everyday Americans that they have personal impacts here. When there's injustice in the United States, it does affect them personally. When there's ongoing militarization and out of control defense budgets, that's affecting them personally in a way that's maybe even easier to see. So I think we have to be able to make it clear to the American people across categories that they have personal interests at stake that affect them. And robust democracy, that seems so abstract. Endless war, that seems very abstract. So I think that the starting point might be to just make it very concrete and clear how their own interests are impinged by contemporary ongoing war.
I'm going to take a couple more questions from people who are listening in. Ian Shen wrote in and asked, what's the cultural impact of a forever war policy and an economic system that backs that up? And to what extent did the Korean War help cultivate a dimension of this dimension of American culture? I'm thinking about the way that being strong or weak on defense or support for the American military and or veterans has become an easy way to tar and feather opponents in domestic politics. So I wonder, Nikhil, if you and your research, is this idea of being strong on national security, did that really grow out of this 1945 to 50 period? And was it a partisan political position at that point, or was that a more bipartisan cultural, phenomenon?
Well, I think the thing that brings the the right, the far right, and even the near right has more isolationist tendencies throughout the 1940s, and is skeptical and is in some ways the obstacle to the growing military budget, interestingly enough. It's what's called the loss of China that really brings the right into the battle over foreign policy. And then you start to get a partisan competition over which is going to be the stronger party on national security. I think that is one of the fundamental distortions that begins to enter our politics in the 1950s, that foreign conflict and threat inflation actually becomes part of a kind of partisan competition that's really about domestic spoils and is in some ways less about actual strategic interests. It becomes more difficult to distinguish those things. And I think we still see that as part of our politics. And I think one of the problems I have in this discussion so far, and I entirely agree with Representative Khanna's emphasis, especially as someone who is in Congress, on making very clear and concrete the cost benefit and the interest calculation. And I also agree with Mary that empathy is extremely important, but it's of a limited purchase. But I think one of the elements we're leaving out is the politics of fear. And the politics of fear has driven American foreign policy, and it's been a heavily manipulated aspect of our politics. And anybody who lived through the selling of the Iraq War after 9/11 knows this viscerally and painfully still, in terms of how we've lost 2 decades in some ways because of the ways we were drawn into that war. I think we have to keep remembering, and we have to keep talking about the way in which American publics are not served, not only in their material interests by this kind of policy, but also the ways in which, in some ways, we're actively misled by the ways in which national security itself becomes an inflated discourse. And becomes a discourse in which we imagine that we are constantly under threat from all these places in the world that we don't understand, when in fact, many of the threats we face are very, very proximate and close to home. They're close to home in the sense that many Americans now don't even have adequate drinking water. They're close to home in the sense that 0.1% of the country now owns as much wealth in the country as the bottom 85%. They're close to home in the way in which, even in the last decade, the median net worth of the American family has dropped 30%. We're in a period of real stress, and I think that is a very powerful way to begin to kind of re-accent what we should be afraid of in a more realistic way. So I really think it's time to talk about cultivating our own garden and not doing so much of the kind of externalization of evil that William Appleman Williams famously talked about, where we imagine that what really bedevils us as a country are the things that people outside, powerful enemies outside, are doing to us. I think that way of approaching things in the world really was central to selling the Cold War. As Arthur Vandenberg famously told Truman, you have to scare the hell out of the American public if you're going to get them to buy this bill of goods. And Truman did it. And presidents after Truman did it. And I think we have to be inoculated against that happening again.
Absolutely. And clearly this president is an expert at doing that. Representative Khanna, what do you think of that? How do you see the calculus of fear changing in the Democratic Party and in the political body itself? I mean, we are living again through extraordinary times, nothing like we've seen in certainly my lifetime, and the degree to which so far nothing has changed in terms of our attitude toward militarism has been quite astonishing to me. And I just wonder, do you see the calculus of fear? Do you see that your constituents and others are looking more internally, as Nikhil said, rather than seeing threat? Certainly, there's a great effort on the part of the presidency right now and elsewhere to hype the military threat posed by China. And I'm just wondering how you see that playing out. Are your constituents and your colleagues on the Hill feeling pressure to respond to external threats or to internal threats?
Well, I think there is an emerging consensus in Congress that the military interventions of the 21st century have been unsuccessful. And you even have Republicans, particularly in the Freedom Caucus, who believe that the war in Iraq was a mistake, that going to war in Iran would be a mistake, that the war in Yemen was a mistake. I mean, we passed the War Powers Resolution, Senator Sanders and I did, through both the Senate and the House, with the Republicans in the House, a number of them supporting it. And that the support of the Saudi bombing there was mistaken. So I think there is a sense of understanding that the military interventionism has been counterproductive to American interests. And on top of that, you have a new generation. We saw in New York 2 young progressives of color get elected. Last class had a lot of them. That represents a different demographic, a different changing demographic of our country that is far more connected with narratives outside America and draws on those narratives. And so you have the possibility in this new century of a more interconnected view to solving global problems, more empathy and understanding of human rights in other parts of the world. I think, though, to do that, we have to understand the significant blind spot that we've had towards the economic neglect of so many parts of the nation, and figuring out how we bring economic opportunity to those places. And then also figuring out how the conversation about what multicultural America looks like is important. But I would just say I do believe that we've never had a true multicultural, multiracial democracy in the history of the world. So what the United States is trying to do is hard, and it would be naive to think there would be a linear line of progress from Obama onwards.
Got very many other questions here. Mary, I wonder if you and Rep. Khanna, I would love to hear how you think Congress. You said a moment ago, Representative Khanna, that Congress doesn't necessarily need only to focus on the war authorization aspect. You could defund military operations or wars at any point. That said, there has been quite a bit of focus of late to pass requirements for war authorizations. Very much agree with that approach, and also to repeal the 2001 open-ended authorization that was used in Afghanistan, and the 2002 that was used for Iraq, both of which are still in place, both of which are being used as allegedly providing legal authorization for some 7 different armed actions right now. Wonder, both of you, what you see as the way forward in terms of addressing those open-ended authorizations. Mary, I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether repeal, replacement, how they should be addressed. And then Representative Khanna, I'd be interested in what you think the likelihood of those actions happening might be.
Well, let me just weigh in briefly. Unending authorizations should be ended. And Congress should never again pass an authorization for the use of force without 2 elements. One is a sunset clause. A sunset clause brings it to an end. The authorization is over by a particular time unless Congress comes back and votes again. And the other is that authorizations need to be focused and precise so they're not subject to the kind of interpretive abuse that we've seen with the 9/11 authorization being repurposed into an all-purpose authorization for war everywhere. You know, the Vietnam authorization was similar, basically giving the president a blank check to do what he wanted. So authorizations for the use of force have to be more carefully crafted, and they should always have a sunset clause, and at least that can happen going forward.
Representative Khanna, what do you think the chances are of Congress imposing that change, certainly going forward and in terms of addressing the old authorizations?
I think the chances are quite high on that. Barbara Lee has been leading this fight since almost 2001, and she's made progress every year in getting more and more people on board. We have the votes in the House. It's now a matter of getting the votes in the Senate and a president to sign it. I actually think Joe Biden, if he's elected, would sign the repeal of these authorizations of force. The challenge always becomes that you have to have an alternative there for people who, I mean, not for some of the progressives, but for the moderates. And they say, well, what do you replace it with? And I think that's where having a Democrat in the White House and Biden may be able to craft something that can satisfy all the wings of the party. I do have to jump to the House caucus call, but I want to very much thank the Professor Duziak and Professor Singh and you, Laura, for allowing me to participate.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time and all your leadership on these issues. In the last 2 minutes, I wonder if I could ask Mary and Nikhil. So this is the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. In 1 minute, a kind of lightning round, I wonder if you might say what you would hope that where we will be next year on the 71st anniversary of this war that started these trends in many ways. Nikhil, you want to offer us a thought?
I'm looking forward to your next panel with the discussion of the Korean War in the Korean Peninsula, because what would be the most remarkable and wonderful thing would be to see continued progress towards the ending of the Korean War on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you. And Mary?
Yes, I do think we need to look to Koreans to help them help with the understanding of what they need from the United States going forward. But I would say two practical things. One is pass HR 152 and end the Korean War. And the other is I would like to see the United States government formally apologize for the massacre of Korean civilians at Naguni at the beginning of the war. It was only one episode where civilians were killed, but the US government has acknowledged that, but never apologized.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all very much and turn it back to my colleague, Trita Parsi, to close us out. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to Nikhil, to Mary, to Laura for a wonderful conversation that shed a lot of light on this and also had very valuable practical advice on how we can reverse many of these trends. Before we close, I would just to quickly mention the panel that we will be holding next week. On July 2nd, we will have a panel on the connection between the militarization of our foreign policy and the militarization of police, including Pentagon bloat, the lobbying power of the defense industry, effects of the war on drugs and the war on terror, in militarizing police departments, all of which brings endless home back to the American public. Speakers will include QI's President Andrew Bacevich, Bill Harting from the Center for International Policy, Wayne McElrath from POGO, and Sarah Dubois from the Pentagon Budget Campaign will moderate that conversation. So please, you don't want to miss that. Go to our website, quincyins.org, and sign up for our mailing list so that you will get notifications of all of our panel discussions as well as our other activities and publications. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today and hope to see you next week.